This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Gill Perkins, CEO of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. We talk about bumblebee populations and habitats, what we can do to encourage and care for bumblebees in our gardens, and about the role of bumblebees in tomato pollination, which came as a complete surprise to me.
The Bumblebee Conservation Trust was started by a rather wonderful person who I think you've interviewed before, Professor Dave Gall, back in 2005. He and a PhD student, Dr. Ben Darwell, had done some really intensive research on bumblebees, and it was them that realised that bumblebees were in severe decline. We have lost 2 to extinction, and 7 UK species are in decline. And it was Dave Gall that formed the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And we are an evidence-based, science-led charity, as you would expect, given our introduction. And we are here to make sure that our bumblebees are thriving and valued by everyone. That's our vision for the future.
Yeah, you're right. Dave has been on the podcast, which I was very lucky to get to talk to him. I can't believe that there's 2 that actually are extinct in terms of species. I mean, how many species are there in total, and are they all in decline?
No, they're not all in decline. So we have 24 species of bumblebees in the UK at the moment. We say that there's 2 at risk, which is the shrill carder bee, found in southern England, Somerset, Kent, southern Wales. And then we have the rather glorious great yellow bumblebee. That's not to say it's my favourite, but it's like a big fluffy yellow ping pong ball. And it's used to be widespread across the UK. Found nationwide before 1950, but now it's restricted to just a handful of small populations on Orkney, Inner and Outer Hebrides, Caithness and Sutherland, and mostly on a habitat called Maca. And there's very small isolated populations, and there's a really big risk when you have isolated populations, both for shrill carder and for great yellow, from inbreeding and any catastrophic events. So, yeah, those are our 2 at risk. And then we say we've got 6 other bumblebees that are also on the at-risk list, like the moss carder and the brown-banded and the rather lovely bilberry bumblebee. So, yeah, we run a project called Bee Walk, which is really important. It's a recording scheme, and it tells us what's happening now, or at least over the period that we've been running it since 2013. And as its a count, we can get an early warning of things going wrong across species, habitat, region. But Bee Walk is absolutely fundamental to our work. So when I walk down my high street here, where I live in Lymington in lovely Hampshire, and people come up to me and say, "Oh, it's the bee lady. How are the bees doing, Gill?" I can tell them how the bees are doing because we have a bee walk report that our lovely bee walkers, of which we have over 800 across the UK, collect that data for us.
Yeah, that must be really useful to have that boots on the ground kind of thing, collecting data. Are there any species then that are thriving?
Well, we have some what we call the big 7, which are common. And one of the ones that is thriving is called Bombus hypnorum, which is the tree bumblebee. Used to be called the ooh la la bee because it came over from France. And it has exploited a niche that our common bumblebees, our native bumblebees, haven't done, which is it likes to nest up high. So you'll often find it in bird boxes or under your eaves. And the tree bumblebee has made amazing progress. It was in southern Britain about 8-9 years ago, and now it's all over the UK, right up north in Scotland and over in Ireland as well. So that particular bee has done incredibly well. But our more common bumblebees, our whitetail, our bufftail, common carder, early bumblebees, these ones are doing okay. But if you read our Bee Walk reports over a period of time, you can tell how climate change is really affecting where they are and how well they do, given that we have some extraordinary springs and summer and autumns now that have a serious effect on how they build their colonies and do well.
Yeah, we do have some very odd weather at the moment. Could you say that the populations that are in decline are balanced out by the ones that are thriving? Does it kind of work like that?
It doesn't really work like that. One of the questions a journalist often asks me is, okay, we lose one species, what does it matter? You've got 23 other species, some of which are doing quite well. But a lot of our bumblebees have different foraging preferences, for example. So some of our bumblebees have long tongues and require different types of plants like foxgloves or comfrey, which have those tubular flowers. Now, bumblebees with long tongues are one of the very few insects that can pollinate those plants. So if we lose a common bumblebee with a long tongue, it may well be that we don't get those plants pollinated as well. And those plants may be useful for other insects as well, or other creatures. So you can't look at a species independently in isolation because they're valuable for all wildlife. If you think of the ecosystem pollination, for example, if a bumblebee or any creature pollinates something like brambles, it produces blackberries, which feed the birds. It produces seeds, which feed other creatures, little small mammals. So it's all interconnected. The whole thing is interconnected.
Yeah, and you mentioned climate change. I mean, is it a question of habitat loss and food source loss as well that's having an impact?
I think there's a couple of things. Really, the main period of bumblebee decline was 1930s to 1960s. And that's coincident with and probably a result of the mechanisation of agriculture. Tractors don't need a network of clover-rich horse paddocks and are far better than horses at ploughing steep slopes, etc. So dig for victory during World War II, all the nice little wild corners got turned over to food production and the shift towards productivity at all costs from the 1947 Agricultural Act and later membership of the EEA. So that was when we lost 97% of our wildflower meadows, and that was the start of the decline. But things like pesticides and other agricultural chemicals like fungicides and herbicides have certainly had a role to play, but they're probably essentially bayoneting the wounded bees at this point, which have already been damaged by the land use changes. So those two factors, agricultural intensification through and pesticides, are key points. But yes, climate change is definitely now affecting bumblebees and the food that they feed on. You know, we have I think it was 2 years ago, we had a drought down here in the south, you know, and the plants that they rely on for forage, you know, just weren't there. They were just dying off. Everything was brown and dead. So yeah, we've really got to think about how we, you know, manage our habitat for bees throughout the UK.
I think sometimes people underestimate the importance of actually using some of their gardens to grow food, because that takes some of the strain off of their agricultural systems, you know, not just in this country, I suppose, but worldwide. But there's probably lots of things that we can do in our gardens to help bumblebees. What would be some of your kind of top ones?
Certainly at this time of year, a lot of people want to tidy up or use those leaf blowers, but we would urge people to leave leaves under hedges, have some messy areas. If you dig into your compost heap, you know, check for hibernating bumblebees, because that's where they like something where nice and warm. You know, for any time of year, we would say don't use pesticides. And there's some really simple things you can do if you have a garden or a window box or just a patio with some pots on it. You can pull up your annual plants after they have self-seeded, and that creates room for new annuals to grow. You can collect and dry out the seeds as well, which is something I do quite a lot. And you can leave those stems of perennial plants to overwinter, because they provide homes and food, not just for bees, but for other insects. I always lift and divide my large perennials so that I get double the plants for free. But it's leaving those logs and leaves and compost heaps undisturbed that really can help. And for this time of year, what's really, really important is, planting now for spring, because that's when the bumblebees will emerge from hibernation. So you're looking at planting those bulbs like alliums or native bluebells or crocus, grape hyacinths, the lovely native daffodils, primroses, snowdrops, tulips, and a couple of trees. Low-cost fruit trees are really good, but pussy willow is a really cracking one, because when bumblebees emerge in spring and you see those willows all with those golden pollinator buds on them, that's what bumblebees really, really love. So those are the sorts of things you can be doing in your garden now. And I think, one of the things I always say is, just talk to people about bumblebees and what they need at this time of year. It's a really easy thing to do.
You first got in contact with me following an episode I did about honeybees, and I was interested to get your take on honeybees and, how they can affect populations of bumblebees or not.
So this is quite a complex subject to talk about. And I want to start off by saying, I'm definitely not against beekeeping or keeping honeybees. Honeybees are good pollinators as much as our wild bees are, our bumblebees and our solitary bees. I think the thing that probably irritates me, if I might say that, is you often see slogans, save the bees, and you'll see honeybees, hexagons, hives, and that sort of thing. And honeybees don't need saving. They're basically livestock. It's a little bit like me saying, I'm going to save the birds, I'm going to keep some chickens. So they don't need saving, and they can, in some circumstances, outcompete our native bees, which are in decline. As we've talked earlier, we've lost 2 to extinction. We've got 2 on the edge of extinction, and we've got 6 at risk. And it's our wild bees and our solitary bees that need the help and need saving. So we just need to be careful about the messaging around honeybees, which again, I will say, they're great to have. But in somewhere like London, for example, where there's been a sort of, I don't know, corporates think that putting honeybee hives on their roof is helping their ESG or their sustainability, whereas it's doing exactly the opposite. Because there's not enough forage within big urban areas like London or Liverpool or Birmingham, Manchester. You need roughly 7 hectares of flower-rich meadows flowering throughout the season to feed 1 hive of honeybees. And that just simply isn't available in dense urban areas. I think the other area where we would offer caution is where we have these rare bees like the shrill carder and the great yellow in particular, and putting hives close to those areas where they may outcompete those bees that are struggling. So on our website, we have a position statement, and it's very balanced about honeybees versus bumblebees, but it's getting that message across, that really strong message that if you really want to save the bees, you have to save our wild bees, our bumblebees and our solitary bees. Those are the ones that are at risk, and those are the ones that provide the majority of our pollination. So that's where we sit with the honeybee issue.
Okay. Actually, going back to what you were saying about the gardens as well and climate, I was thinking about how I do seem to see bees out kind of later in the year and earlier in the year as well. Is that something that's an actual thing that's happening?
Down here in the south, where we are warmer, and certainly where I live, we're sort of protected a little bit by the Isle of Wight. We have what's called genetic risk takers. And so this is our most common bumblebee, Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, who will stay out all winter. They won't go into hibernation. They'll need food. So we would, really urge people to grow flowers such as winter heathers, honeysuckle, mahonia, particularly in these areas where these bees don't go into hibernation, so that they have something to feed on during the winter. It's unlikely they'll build a colony. It's usually the queen's just getting ready to build a colony when the weather warms up in the spring. But yeah, you do see some bees, particularly the buff-tailed bumblebee, now awake and alert and collecting pollen through the winter.
And it's funny, you kind of mentioned all these names of the bees, and as a gardener, I can probably tell you like hundreds of plant species and their Latin names and identify them all, as distinct from each other. But I cannot, for the life of me, get to learn the bees. And so when I'm in the garden, I'll see loads of bumblebees, but I've got bee blindness. I can't remember the patterning on them. I can't identify them adequately. Is there some way that people could kind of learn more about bumblebees at a level so that it actually sinks in?
Without wishing to be too salesy, we have a wonderful book called Introduction to Bumblebees, if you like books. We also have a free app, which you can go online if you have an iPhone and download that. And that has the 6 most common bumblebees on it. On our website, if you go on our YouTube site, there are some short ID videos to help you start learning about bees. I always think the best time to start identifying bees is spring, mainly because you've only got one caste flying around, and that's the queen. She's usually come out of hibernation, so she's fresh and furry, and all her colours are in place. And you always start off looking at the colour of their bottom, never mind the stripes and the length of antennae or anything like that. You can pretty much guarantee in spring, when you see bumblebees emerging, that they are queens, so you know they're girls. And if you look at the colour of their bum, that's the first indication of what species they are. You can then look at the number of stripes they've got. But the 2 that are really classic are the common carder, which is the all ginger bee, and that's very easy. And that new one I talked about earlier, the tree bumblebee, which is black, orange and white, and nothing like any of our other native bees. What becomes tricky, and it becomes tricky for me too, is later on in the season when they start, the girl workers start emerging, and then later on when the males are born, and then it gets a bit more difficult because they get a bit shabby, get in and out of flowers, and their fur rubs off, and they get a bit sunburnt as well, and then the colours fade, and then completely agree with you, it does become more difficult. But if you learn by the way, if you learn to identify male bumblebees, you can handle them quite nicely, because they're a bit dopey, and they don't go back to the nest, they stay on the flowers all night, and B, they don't have a sting, because a sting is part of the egg laying mechanism. So if you learn to identify male bumblebees, then you can not be frightened of them, and handle with care, not very often, but you can handle them.
That puts me in mind, there was a very nice local ecologist who came to a garden where I work, and he was very excited because he thought he'd found, I think it's a broken belted bee.
Yes,
and
yeah.
It wasn't. In the end, he decided it was just that, like, it had basically gone a bit bald in the middle. So,
yeah. I mean, if you were to shave a bumblebee, and I do not recommend that anybody shaves a bumblebee, you'll find they're all black. So it's the chitin underneath that is black. It's only the fur that is the colour. So once the fur gets rubbed off, you're in real trouble identifying them.
Anyone who's got like a conservatory or a polytunnel or greenhouse, that kind of thing, will know that the bees can go in there and they can get stuck, because I think, from what I've been told, they're kind of following the line of the sun, and they'll just stay in one corner until they're absolutely exhausted. Is there anything that you can do to combat that?
Really, you want them in your greenhouse to help pollinate if you've got plants growing in there like tomatoes, which are essential. Shall I tell you a little bit about tomatoes? So I'll tell you a little about tomatoes. So bumblebees are the only insect that can pollinate tomatoes. So tomato flowers, unlike many other flowers, hold their pollen very tightly in the anther, and they also don't have any nectar, which is normally bait for insects. So a plant has co-evolved with bees of all types, and they use nectar as the bait to get the bee in, to get covered in pollen and pollinate all their flowers. but tomato plants are different. So the only way to get at that pollen in the anther is to vibrate it. Now, bumblebees have this amazing method of disconnecting their wings from their thorax. They can vibrate their chest muscles, their thorax muscles at an amazing 400 hertz. And as they grip on to the anther in the tomato flower, that vibration opens it up and releases the pollen. And only bumblebees can do that. And all of our major industrial units that grow tomatoes, like Planet Earth over in Kent, use imported bumblebees. So we import probably not about 100,000 boxes of commercially farmed bumblebees to underpin our soft fruit industry in this country, because only bumblebees can pollinate the tomatoes. And they're used for strawberries and raspberries as well, because they give a better quality fruit.
I did not know that. Okay, so you want them in there, but you don't want them to get stuck in there.
No, leave the window open, or in the greenhouse it's easier. You can leave windows open and doors open, and they will eventually find their way out. In a conservatory, the only thing, if you're frightened of them, try not to be, is just to put a glass over it, a bit of card, slide it up, and then release them outside gently. I mean, you can hold them. It's unlike, I've never been stung by a bee, and I've handled them carefully for a long time, but just carefully, urge them out by, I do it with spiders as well. You just put a glass over them, slide a bit of card up between the glass and the window, captures the bumblebee, and then release it out into the open.
And it's quite often as well, a lot of people talk about finding drowsy bumblebees and kind of feeding them to get them going again. If you did find one that was maybe just on the floor on the path and looking a bit kind of disorientated, or maybe like a really wet bee, is there anything that you should be doing?
There's a sequence of events here. If you find a drowsy bee, as you've called, there's two things. One, it might be exhausted and needing food, or two, it might be coming to the end of its life, because some of the worker bees have very short lives. But again, if you're near somewhere where there's flowers, gently pick up the bumblebee, put it on a leaf or something if you don't want to put it on your hand, and lift it onto a flower. If you're at home or have access to a little bit of sugar and water, not honey, because honey can spread diseases from honeybees to bumblebees, but use a 50-50 water and sugar on a little teaspoon or on a sponge and offer it to the bumblebee, and that might revive it enough if there's not flowers nearby. But those are the two things that I would do.
Thank you very much to Gill, and I hope we've all learned a bit about better caring for bumblebees. And thank you to you for listening as well. Long-time listeners will know I don't hold any particular affection for the target of Dr. Ian Bedford's Bug of the Week, but if you're a fan of fuchsias, listen well.
Almost 200 years ago, early Victorian plant breeders were busily hybridising fuchsias and creating many stunning new varieties for the formal gardens across Britain. Although it wasn't really for another 100 years before fuchsias became popular within home gardens, where they've remained a common sight each year within borders and hanging baskets throughout the summer months. During 2007, though, fuchsia growers in southern England began experiencing some previously unseen problems with their plants. Flowers were either failing to open or were deformed, and the tips of new shoots developed into a tangled mass of strangely distorted and unrecognisable growth. But with no signs of a plant pest, the cause was unclear, and thought initially to be linked to a virus. However, with some careful dissection under the microscope, it didn't take long for someone to discover and identify the culprit, a non-native species of arachnid, invisible to the naked eye, and called the Fuchsia Gall mite. First discovered on fuchsias in South America during the 1970s, these sap-sucking mites not only fed and reproduced specifically within the meristematic new growth regions of the plants, but also secreted chemicals that caused galling and prevented the cells from developing into normal leaves and flower buds. With the global trade in ornamental plants, the mites soon spread into Europe and then on to mainland Britain. And since their initial discovery here, they further dispersed within most of the coastal regions of southern England, with localised outbreaks in Wales and the West Midlands. And their dispersal is likely to continue, since it's now known that they can move to new locations by hitching a ride on bees and other pollinators, as well as being blown by the wind. Controlling Fuchsia gall mite, though, is not a simple task, as there are no effective chemicals available for home garden use. So the only real option is to regularly remove and destroy all affected plant growth during the summer months, reduce hardy fuchsias as much as possible during autumn, and to be aware that mites could still be active under bud scales or within the growing tips throughout winter on frost-protected plants.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.